The monsters of Halloween were never born from imagination but from memory. Long before children wore masks and carried plastic pumpkins filled with candy, there was a night when people gathered under the dying light of autumn. The air smelled of smoke and wet earth. Faces were painted with ash cloaked in furs and animal bones. They stood before great bonfires, whispering to the flames as if speaking to someone unseen. The fire wasn't meant for warmth. It was a boundary, an ancient line drawn between the living and the dead. That night was called Samhain, the end of the harvest and the beginning of darkness. It was the night when the veil between worlds was said to grow thin, when the spirits of the departed wandered back to taste the air of the living. People left offerings at their doors, bowls of grain, milk, bits of meat, not as gifts but as bribes, a way of saying, "We remember you. Please pass us by." They wore masks, not to celebrate but to survive, to hide from the eyes of those they once loved who might not recognize mercy once they had crossed into shadow. Each costume was a disguise against being taken. Each dance, each chant, each flicker of fire was a ritual of fear turned into faith. When the Romans arrived, they saw these rituals and folded them into their own Feralia, the day when the dead were honored. Centuries later, the church replaced the fires with candles and called it All Hallows' Eve. But the fire never truly died. It simply learned new names. Every civilization has its night of fear. The Celts had Samhain. The Romans had Feralia. The Mexica had the Day of the Dead. Even the Egyptians had nights when the boundary between life and afterlife wavered. It seems humanity has always needed a way to speak with the darkness, to offer it something before it takes too much. That's the irony of Halloween. It was never about pretending to be monsters. It was about remembering that once monsters were real because they were us. Our rituals, our fears, our hunger for control over what we could not understand. The masks and the stories, the vampires and the ghosts, they are all echoes of ancient negotiations with the unseen. So, when we light a candle in a carved pumpkin, we are not merely celebrating a holiday. We are repeating an oath older than language to respect what lives beyond the flame and to never forget that fear was once a form of worship. Because once upon a time, the line between faith and terror was as thin as a shadow, and every October it flickers back to life. They called it the last night of summer, the night when the fields fell silent. The villagers had gathered their final harvest, their hands cracked from the cold, and the work their breath white in the dusk. It was said that once the sun set, the world would no longer belong to the living. It would belong to them, the ones who had crossed over. At the heart of the village, on a hill crowned with standing stones, the fires were lit. Men carried torches soaked in animal fat. Women tossed handfuls of herbs and dried flowers into the flames to sweeten the air for the spirits. The smoke rose like dark silk into the starlit sky. Each spark was a message: we have not forgotten you. They believed that during Samhain, the border between life and death dissolved. The spirits of ancestors wandered freely, as did creatures that had never been human. To step outside without protection was to risk being seen by them, recognized, taken. So people disguised themselves, covered their faces in soot, wore animal skins, horns, and masks carved from wood. It was not celebration. It was camouflage. In some villages, they would slaughter livestock, not for food, but for offering. The blood was smeared along door frames and stone thresholds to mark the home as blessed. The heart and bones were thrown into the fire so that the ancestors could feed on their essence through smoke. They said that if the fire burned evenly, the spirits were pleased. If it sputtered and died, it meant the dead were angry and winter would be cruel. By midnight, the music began. Low drums, slow chanting, words that had long ceased to mean anything but still carried weight in the air. The villagers danced in circles, their shadows trembling on the ground like restless ghosts. At the edge of the firelight, the druids watched in silence, their faces painted white, their eyes lined with black ash. They were the mediators between the two worlds, the keepers of the old laws. Some accounts say they wore antlers to mimic the horned god, the symbol of death and rebirth. To outsiders, it must have looked like madness, a tribe worshipping beasts. But to them it was order. Each gesture, each chant, each offering was a way to keep the cycle balanced. If they fed death a little, it would spare the living. That was the bargain. Centuries later, when Rome conquered Celtic lands, their priests observed these strange customs and recognized something familiar. They too had a day for the dead, Feralia, when offerings were made to ancestors. Over time, Roman rituals mingled with Celtic fire festivals. The boundaries blurred as they always do. Fear adapted. Belief survived. When Christianity arrived, it did not erase Samhain, it dressed it in new robes. The church renamed the day All Hallows' Eve, turning spirits into souls, druids into saints, and pagan fires into candles of prayer. But beneath the hymns, the same rhythm pulsed. The bonfires became candlelit vigils. The masks became carved pumpkins. The offerings became prayers for the dead. The form changed, but the instinct remained to honor what we fear. Even the symbols endured. The black and orange, the bats and skeletons, the whispering wind. Every October we perform the same rite without knowing why. We tell stories of vampires and witches, yet their roots reach back to those first Samhain nights. The vampire as the spirit who drank the warmth of the living. The witch as the old woman who spoke the language of the dead. Monsters, after all, are just the names we give to ancient gods once they fall out of favor. In some forgotten parts of Ireland, people still light candles in hollowed turnips, the ancestor of the jack-o'-lantern. According to legend, there was a man named Jack who tricked the devil and was condemned to wander the earth with only a burning coal to light his way. But even that story is older than it seems. It was never about Jack, it was about light itself, the fragile flame that keeps the darkness at bay. By the time Halloween reached America, stripped of its faith and fear, it had become something else, entirely a shadow of its origin. The rituals were softened, the fire replaced by porch lights, the offerings by candy, the prayers by laughter. Yet something ancient lingers. Every mask worn by a child, every glowing pumpkin by the door is a faint echo of that first night when humanity looked into the dark and whispered, "Please, let us see another dawn." Because Samhain was never about death. It was about endurance, about facing what you cannot control and naming it so it cannot name you first. And that perhaps is the oldest magic of all. Samhain was not the only night when the living spoke to the dead. Across oceans and centuries, humanity kept inventing different names for the same fear. The costumes changed, the gods changed, but the longing to touch what was lost, to keep it from turning against us, remained the same. In ancient Egypt, long before the Celts ever lit their bonfires, the people of the Nile held a festival for the spirits of their ancestors. They called it the Feast of the Valley. Families crossed the river to visit tombs carved into cliffs carrying baskets of bread, beer, and flowers. The night belonged to the dead. The city emptied into silence while candles flickered in the necropolis. Mothers whispered the names of their ancestors, believing that as long as a name was spoken, the soul still lived. In that moment, love and terror were indistinguishable. Death was not an ending, it was a guest returning home. Thousands of miles away, in the mountains of Japan, there was Oban, the summer festival of lanterns. For 3 nights each year, paper lamps floated down rivers and across the sea, lighting the way for ancestral spirits to visit their descendants. Families danced the Bonodori, slow circular movements, symbolizing the cycle of life and death. The living and the dead moved together beneath crimson lanterns like reflections in the same mirror. The Japanese never feared ghosts the way others did. Their ghosts were family, but the rule was the same everywhere. When the last lantern went out, the spirits had to return. To forget that rule was to invite them to stay. Across the ocean in Mesoamerica, the Aztecs honored Mictlantecuhtli, the Lady of the Dead. Her mouth was always open, ready to swallow the stars. They believed death was part of a divine rhythm, life feeding death, death feeding life. Skulls were painted bright yellow and red, not as warnings but as blessings. The dead were invited to feast beside the living, and people sang so the spirits would not feel lonely. Even after the Spanish arrived and called it El Dia de los Muertos, the rhythm survived. Masks became sugar skulls. Altars replaced pyramids. But behind every candle lay the same truth: remembrance was a form of protection. Farther east, the Chinese celebrated Zhongyuan, the ghost festival. In the 7th lunar month, it was said that the gates of the underworld opened, letting hungry souls wander the earth. Families burned paper offerings, money clothes, even miniature houses so the dead would not envy the living. Some left bowls of rice on windowsills for forgotten spirits who had no family left to remember them. The wind carried ash through the streets like gray snow. Monks chanted sutras to guide the lost back to the shadows. The fear was never about death itself, but about being forgotten. When you place these rituals side by side, something becomes clear. No culture truly believed they could conquer death. They only learned to negotiate with it. The Celts offered blood to the fire. The Egyptians offered bread and names. The Japanese offered light. The Aztecs offered song. The Chinese offered memory. And all of them, in their own ways, built bridges out of fear, because fear, when shared, becomes devotion. Historians call this ancestor veneration, but that term is too clean. It misses the trembling hands lighting the lanterns, the whisper in the dark, the moment when someone feels a presence just beyond the flame. These were not superstitions, they were survival. The ritual was humanity's oldest language, a dialogue with the void. What is Halloween then, if not another dialect of that same language? Every pumpkin glowing on a doorstep is a lantern for someone's ghost. Every mask hides a name, just as the Japanese dance hides grief behind a smile. Every piece of candy given away is an echo of the offerings left on tombs and altars across the world. We repeat these gestures without knowing why, because the memory of fear is written deeper than faith. Perhaps that is why these nights never truly disappeared. They evolve, migrate, adapt, carried by trade routes, wars, and missionaries, changing shape like smoke, but never vanishing. The soul of the ritual endures because it fulfills a need. No civilization can erase the need to make peace with death by pretending we can speak to it. And if you listen closely on Halloween, on Oban, on the Day of the Dead, you might hear the same whisper in every tongue: we remember you. Do not take us yet. Because across every border, every age, every faith, humanity has always been haunted by the same realization: the monsters we fear are often the echoes of those we once loved. The deeper archaeologists dig into the earth, the more it begins to resemble a memory. Layers of ash bone and offerings, each one a whisper from the people who feared the dark before us. And in almost every ancient culture, these traces tell the same story: fear was never random. It was organized, ritualized, engineered into the structure of human survival. When excavations began across Ireland and Scotland, archaeologists found circles of blackened stones, the remnants of ritual fires. Scattered among them were fragments of animal bones, charred wheat, and small human figurines carved from wood. Some were burned, some buried intact. To a modern eye, they looked like superstition. To those who once made them, they were insurance. Fire, food, effigies, all were offerings meant to keep balance between two worlds. The people who performed those rites didn't think they were summoning monsters. They believed they were feeding hunger so that it wouldn't devour them in return. In other dig sites, scientists uncovered burial mounds where the dead were placed in fetal position, surrounded by tools, jewelry, and most chillingly masks. Not to disguise the dead, but to disguise them from recognition. Anthropologists believe this practice reflected an ancient fear that the dead might try to return through the body's memory of identity. The mask erased that memory. Death, in a sense, was given a new face. Modern psychology calls this the ritual of separation, a universal human need to define where life ends and the unknown begins. Our brains are wired to seek control in chaos. When confronted with death, the mind creates patterns to make sense of it. That's why ritual exists. It transforms fear into action. Even meaningless gestures, lighting a candle, saying a name, convince us we have agency against the void. But perhaps the most haunting discovery came not from Europe, but from Anatolia. In the ancient city of Çatalhöyük, archaeologists found homes with skulls buried beneath the floors. These were not graves, they were offerings. The dead were literally built into the foundation of life. Families lived above them, cooked above them, raised children above them. Death was not buried away. It was woven into daily existence. Imagine sleeping every night knowing that the bones of your ancestors rested beneath your bed, watching silently as you dreamed. To the people of that world, safety came not from forgetting the dead, but from keeping them close. Neuroscientists studying ancient rituals suggest something remarkable: the act of ritual itself alters the human brain. Repetition, chanting, rhythmic movement, all these trigger the release of endorphins and dopamine, numbing fear and inducing trance-like calm. In other words, ritual is both medicine and illusion. It convinces the body that order exists even when the world collapses. The more dangerous life becomes, famine, plague, war, the more elaborate the rituals grow. Fear, it seems, is the soil from which faith blooms. Even today, the pattern persists. Candles in churches, incense at funerals, flowers laid on graves. These gestures echo the same neurological comfort our ancestors sought beside the Samhain fires. Modern humans tell themselves they no longer believe in ghosts, but our hands betray us. We still light the flame. Historians often say that monsters evolved as metaphors for disease and death. The vampire mirrored the plague, the werewolf, the chaos of untamed violence, the witch, the fear of women's knowledge. But if you study these myths closely, something deeper emerges. They are all rituals in disguise. The vampire's bite is a corrupted communion. The werewolf's transformation, a warning against losing humanity. The witch's curse, an inverted prayer. Each legend is a coded survival mechanism, teaching through terror what could not be explained by reason. And this may be the oldest truth of all: fear kept us alive. Ritual gave that fear a language. Myth gave it a face. When scientists analyze soot samples from ancient hearths or DNA from sacrificial remains, they are not merely uncovering violence, they are uncovering empathy. The need to make meaning out of mortality. The flickering fire that once burned in caves and temples is the same light that glows in our screens each October when we tell ghost stories and watch horror films. The tools have changed, but the instinct has not. Some archaeologists call this the archaeology of emotion. They study how belief leaves fingerprints in the material world, how fear shapes architecture, how ritual leaves soot and stone. In that sense, Halloween is not just a festival. It is an artifact of human consciousness. The proof that thousands of years later we still haven't learned to live without the dead. So, when you stare into a candle this Halloween and feel a shiver you can't explain, remember your body knows something your mind has forgotten. It remembers the ancient fires. It remembers the deal we made long ago to give the darkness something small so it wouldn't take everything. And as long as we keep that promise, the monsters stay on their side of the flame. At least that's what we like to believe. Every ritual begins with a symbol, and every symbol hides a truth too heavy to be spoken. Fire, mask, blood, shadow, 4 ancient languages that humanity once used to speak with what it feared most. We still use them today, only now we call them art, religion, or tradition. But their meaning has not changed. The fire was never merely light. It was the oldest border ever drawn, the first line of defense between existence and oblivion. The Celts believed that if the flame flickered, the dead were watching. The Egyptians placed oil lamps in tombs so the souls would find their way home. The Japanese sent lanterns floating down rivers to guide their ancestors back to the sea. And even now, we still place candles in windows, in churches, in pumpkins, small suns against the night. We tell ourselves it's decoration, but somewhere deep inside the body still remembers what the flame means. Stay close to the light. The dark remembers your name. Then came the mask, perhaps humanity's most fragile miracle. To wear a mask was not to hide from others, but from spirits. In Celtic ritual, masks made of animal skulls confused the dead, making them believe they were among their own. In Africa, the mask turned a man into an ancestor. In Greece, it turned an actor into a god. Psychologists now say masks allow us to step outside the self to become what we fear, and in doing so, master it. Maybe that's why Halloween still thrives. For one night, we're permitted to wear the face of what hunts us. It's not play, it's catharsis. And then there is blood, the color of both life and loss. Ancient people saw it as the purest offering because it was proof of existence. To spill blood on the earth was to remind it that we were still here. The idea of sacrifice wasn't born from cruelty, but from reciprocity. If life takes, it must also give. In that sense, the blood ritual was not death, it was conversation. Modern science can sterilize, separate, and explain it away, but no theory has ever replaced the sacred instinct that once linked blood to meaning. Even today, when we speak of bloodlines, blood oaths, or family ties, we are repeating ancient languages written in crimson. And finally, the shadow, the symbol no one could destroy. Every ritual had one purpose: to control the shadow, not banish it. Because ancient people understood something we've forgotten: you cannot cast out the darkness without also losing the light that defines it. The shadow is not evil, it's memory. It's the shape of everything we've tried to hide from ourselves: fear, grief, desire, guilt. Carl Jung called it the other half of the soul. The Celts called it the old god in the wood. Both knew the same truth: the monsters outside are mirrors of the monsters within. That's why the symbols endure. They aren't primitive, they're honest. They remind us that fear, devotion, and transformation are the same motion, just seen from different sides of the fire. We no longer dance around the flames or chant to the night, but we still gather every year to watch the dark, to test ourselves against it. Halloween, like every ritual before it, is a ceremony of balance. It allows us to touch the forbidden safely, to make friends with what could destroy us. The fire burns, the mask smiles, the blood remembers, and the shadow listens. Together they form the oldest story humanity ever told, that in the heart of darkness, meaning is born. Maybe monsters were never real. Maybe they were simply the shapes we gave to fear so that we could finally look it in the eye. Throughout history, humanity has been haunted by its own reflection in the dark. Every culture drew it differently. Claws in one land, horns in another, pale faces in the east, shadows without form in the north. Yet beneath all those differences lies the same question that echoes through the ages: what if the monster is only us seen from the other side of the fire? Psychologists call this projection, philosophers call it myth, but perhaps it is something older than both. From the first time we buried our dead, we've been trying to negotiate with what waits inside us, the shadow that awakens when the light fades. Carl Jung once wrote that every person carries a shadow, the hidden self, the instinct, the part of us that wishes to destroy, devour, and survive. We call it evil only because it reminds us of what we could become if the mask ever slipped. That is why the ancients performed their rituals, not merely to honor gods or ward off spirits, but to face what was within. When the Celts painted their faces with ash, when the Egyptians wrapped their dead in linen, when the Aztecs sang to their Lady of Bones, they were not calling to the outside world. They were speaking to something internal. The bonfire was not a weapon against the dark, but a mirror reflecting it. In that reflection, they saw both terror and truth. The line between man and monster, faith and fear, was never in the earth or the heavens. It was drawn in the human heart. We tell ourselves that we have outgrown these fears. We live in cities of light, protected by logic, medicine, and psychology. But every October, we return to the dark. We carve faces into pumpkins, dim the lamps, and retell the same old stories about things that move when we are asleep. Why? Because we still need them. Fear has always been a kind of memory. It reminds us that wonder and terror share the same root, that awe is born from the same place as dread. We may not believe in demons or curses anymore, but we still feel that shiver when the wind passes through an open window at night. That is the body remembering what the soul has forgotten. In this way, monsters are sacred. They are not the enemies of humanity, but the proof of it. They stand at the edge of what we can understand, marking the limits of our power. Every vampire, every ghost, every ancient demon is a warning disguised as a story. They whisper, "This is what happens when you forget to fear." Power without reverence becomes destruction. Knowledge without restraint becomes madness. Civilization without humility becomes its own curse. The monsters that haunted our ancestors were never just about death, they were about balance. Perhaps that is why the oldest tales end the same way. The hero looks into the eyes of the beast and recognizes himself. From Gilgamesh to Beowulf, from Dante to Frankenstein, the pattern remains unchanged. The victory is never the monster's death, but its understanding. When we learn to face our shadow, we stop being ruled by it. When we can name it, it no longer hunts us. That is what the ancient rituals were always for, to name the darkness before it could speak our name first. So maybe Halloween has always been more than a celebration of the dead. Maybe it is a rehearsal for being human, a night when we are allowed to remember the truth that our ancestors never forgot. The masks, the fire, the stories, all of them are the remnants of that old dialogue between reason and the abyss. We keep repeating it century after century because deep down we know that the monsters are not going anywhere. They live where they always have, just beneath the surface of belief. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all: monsters were never the opposite of faith. They were its reflection. They remind us that fear too was once sacred, and that the only way to survive the darkness is to understand that it was always ours. Every fire eventually fades, but the darkness it held back never leaves. When the last flame of Samhain died, when the candles in the churches burned to wax and the songs of the dead fell silent, the people always asked the same question in their hearts: did it work? Did the ritual truly keep the shadows away, or did it only remind them how close the shadows already were? Centuries have passed since those nights of fear, yet the ritual continues hidden beneath modern comforts. We light our candles and call it atmosphere. We put on masks and call it fun. We carve faces into pumpkins and call it decoration. But what if those gestures are not games? What if they are echoes, old codes carried unconsciously through generations, each one still performing the same ancient bargain without realizing it? Perhaps that is why the feeling never truly changes. No matter how bright the lights, Halloween always brings a chill that logic cannot explain. Science would say it's coincidence. Culture would say it's tradition. But maybe it's neither. Maybe something in us remembers the agreement humanity made with the dark long ago, the promise to respect what we cannot understand. We no longer offer blood or chant to forgotten gods, yet every October we reenact the ritual perfectly. We build the fire, we feed it with fear, and we hope the night will let us go. What if the monsters of Halloween are not waiting outside but watching from within? What if each story we tell, each costume we wear, each flickering candle by the window is a message meant for something listening on the other side? For thousands of years we've believed these rites were about keeping death at bay. But what if they were never meant to protect us? What if they were meant to sustain the balance? Because rituals do not die. They only change their masks. The fire becomes electric light, the chant becomes a song, the offering becomes candy, but the intention remains. Every year, without knowing it, we honor that ancient pact again. We keep the darkness fed just enough to keep it quiet. And so when you stand before your door this Halloween and see the children in masks approaching through the mist, look closely at the flame inside your jack-o'-lantern. Listen to the wind. Somewhere beneath the laughter and the noise there is still a whisper, the same one that's haunted humanity since the first fire was lit. Keep the ritual, keep the fear, keep the light burning. Because maybe, just maybe, the reason the monsters never returned is that the rituals still work.